Now, when we're talking about the delayed hemolytic reaction, this is actually, one way to think about it is it's going to present very similarly to the acute hemolytic reaction in the sense that the mechanism in many ways is the same with some slight variation. The classic thing that's going to help you distinguish these two is really going to be the timeline and the severity of disease. Okay, so let me explain a little bit. You can see that the etiology is going to be incompatibility with red blood cell antigens, essentially the same thing as the acute hemolytic reaction. The antigens that we're talking about are not your classic antigens being A, B, right? AB type blood, type O blood. We're not talking about that. We're talking about some of these other antigens that in general are sometimes considered to just be more minor blood group antigens. They're not like the major ones we typically talk about. So the KIT antigen, the D antigen, remember this D antigen is essentially going to be the RH antigen that we talk about a lot when we talk about Rh positivity in an Rh negative mother, right? An Rh positive fetus to an Rh negative mother that then causes on re-exposure hemolytic disease of the newborn, which we've kind of touched on already and we'll talk about in greater detail in the future. But the point here is that we'll have some incompatibility again with the recipient and the donor. Now, in these situations, because you think about this, these antigens, when you think about them, like I said, you kind of think about them as being more of a minor antigen. You don't think about them in the same way as the ones that we talked about. And so when I think about minor antigens, I'm thinking that it's going to take a lot more exposure to get a strong reaction because the antigens are minor. Okay, so that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about this when I think about delayed hemolytic reactions, when I think about board questions with delayed hemolytic reactions. Now, I'm not talking about, I want you to separate here hemolytic disease of the newborn from this. And the reason I say that is because it just presents differently. Usually, if they're asking a board question about hemolytic disease of the newborn, it's going to be asked about in a very different way than a question that asks about a delayed hemolytic reaction, like you'll see here. Okay, so I want you to separate those two. Even though the RHD antigen is here, we're not talking about hemolytic disease of the newborn in this example. I'm more so talking about a patient that gets repeated transfusions and then has antibodies that essentially form against an Rh positive donor. Okay, that's what I'm talking about here. Not hemolytic disease of the newborn, which is fatal to the fetus. Very different in terms of severity. Okay, so I just want you to make sure you're sharp on that. Now, when we're talking about the mechanism, like we said, it's going to be very similar. Donor red blood cells are going to be destroyed, right? The person that's giving the blood, their red blood cells are going to be destroyed. Why are they destroyed? Well, the recipient is going to have preformed antibodies. Okay, so let me explain. So if I have a red blood cell here, okay, so I'm going to take some red blood cell, and again, we're going to exclude the major antigens. So we're just going to look at these minor antigens. Let's just say that this red blood cell has an Rh antigen. Okay, so we can say that this is essentially an Rh positive donor. Okay, we can also use the KIT antigen. We're just using this as an example. And this red blood cell is going to be in my donor. Okay, so this is going to be in my donor. Now again, this donor, right, is going to donate this blood to a patient. And this patient, let's just say, for example, this patient doesn't have an Rh antigen. Okay, so we would say that this patient is going to be Rh negative, right? Patient doesn't have that antigen. So the donor would give their blood cells to the recipient, right? To the recipient. And the recipient might say, hey, this is foreign. This Rh antigen is foreign, but it's a minor antigen, right? It's minor. So what I might do is I might just make, a couple B or T cells against that antigen. Maybe I'll make a couple antibodies against that antigen for future exposure, right? And if this happens frequently or over some extended period of time, I might get some class switching potentially, right? I might get some IgG antigens, etc. And I might also, over some period of time, generate a memory response with B cells, T cells, right? Plasma cell factories generating antibodies. But the thing is, for this stuff to happen, especially against a minor antigen, I'm going to need repeated exposure, right? I'm going to need to have more and more exposure to this Rh antigen to really generate a strong response. That's the point that we're making here, and that's what you have to think about. And so this is going to be the anamnestic response. Essentially, what we're saying here is after you've had repeat exposure, right, repeated blood donations from Rh positive antigens, in this example, we would eventually start to generate some pretty significant responses, but it's going to take a while because, again, like I said, these antigens are minor when we're talking about delayed hemolytic reaction. Again, different from the hemolytic disease of the newborn, right? We're not saying this is necessarily the same exact thing. It's not in terms of severity. And the concept here is if I had an antigen on this donor cells, it's again going to be the recipient's antibodies that will go and bind to that Rh antigen on the donor. Okay, so that's what we're saying. And so we're marking the donor's red blood cell, right? Destruction of the donor's red blood cells, right? We're marking the donor's red blood cells for destruction on repeated exposures. So what do you think is going to be the classic patient that has a delayed hemolytic reaction? Well, I just told you, right? It's going to be patients that have multiple blood transfusions. What's another way they could ask this? How about a patient that frequently uses IV drugs or shares needles potentially, right? So a patient with IV drug use would also be very classic. And you might be saying, well, why is that? Well, if the patient is constantly exposed to other blood types that have these minor antigens, when they get transfused, they might have a reaction because they've had repeated exposures to other blood types that have these minor antigens. And again, type 2 hypersensitivity, we talked about this, right? Antibody binding to the surface of the red blood cell, marking it for destruction, classically complement mediated, right? We talked about that in the hypersensitivity video. And the key thing here, the important thing, is that this is going to take a little bit longer to get symptomatic from, because again, we're saying minor, right? Just think of this as kind of a weaker response overall. So usually it's going to take a while to get the symptoms to present. And when they do present, they're mild, they're self-limited. We're not going to necessarily stop a transfusion in a patient with a delayed hemolytic reaction because the transfusion has been over for weeks, right? This is going to present much later on. Now, if you did the same tests though that we talked about previously with acute hemolytic reactions, you'd get similar results. You get a positive Coombs test usually, right? Because you have antibodies bound to the surface of these red blood cells. So if I gave an anti-RH antibody, I should get agglutination for the reasons we mentioned in the previous videos. Okay, and the same thing is true with some of these markers here. But again, because this is minor, right, this is going to, especially in real life, this is going to be variable. But this is the kind of things that you want to think about. You want to think about what's happening, and that will help you cipher through the diagnostics. And we've talked about all of this already in previous videos. So if you're not familiar with some of this, go back, check out the previous videos. I think that would really help you kind of understand this if you're having any trouble here.